Hello class, I will be doing my presentation on investigating novices and essential reflections on their programming process. The authors: Dastami Laksa, Benjamin Yi, Harrison Quick, and Emmy J. Cole from the University of Washington, and the presenter, myself. Abstract: 31 novice programmers had to be investigated in a 10-week span. Each of the programmers had to remove their journals for self-reflecting purposes, and the results was stated that self-regulation during programming is highly variable in programming. The key words throughout this project are programming, metacognition, and self-regulation. The introduction. Self-regulation is defined as the ability to be aware of one's thoughts and actions. The analysis of teaching and learning programming. Many studies show self-regulation is scaffolding benefit for the novice programmers. And software engineers are more systematic and self-reflective. The method. The learners had to write in journals throughout the 10-week course in programming sessions. The learners had to use the journals to reflect on their problem solving and self-regulation. The journals were served to be a prompt to self-regulate and self-regulation through the peers for data reflection, and also will have less exposure towards participants and how they are working. Course and the participants. The course was broken down to 31 undergraduate students, which were 25 men, 6 women, and 13 juniors and 17 seniors. The course was broken down to 4 projects over 10 weeks. The first project, the students had to create a website by using HTML and CSS. The second project, the students had to create a web-based game with JavaScript. The third project, the students had to create a day explorer by using the React framework. And the fourth and the final project in the 10 weeks, the students had to create a messaging application by using the React framework and the Firebase backend. Data collection. Each student had to submit a journal for the 4 projects. Also, they had to sit in class for a lecture that lasted 20 minutes about the framework of problem solving during programming courses. Each journal had to be documented for self-regulation behaviors, and it was provided a list of definitions to cover all the demonstrations and the behaviors, and start a time for coding sessions. And the journals was to help the students reflect on the process and review the journal and briefly describe all the points that the students had trouble reflecting on the process or writing all the parts of the journal. And the journals make you want to think back of any time in the last 2 weeks that you had to stop and understand and reflect the programming process where you're either not programming or writing your journal or just find it difficult and describing why it was difficult. And the primary source of data was the student journals. And despite of the journals being a part of the grade, some of the students had to fail to submit the journal. But in all, it was collected. It was 106 journals with a combination of 4,227 statements of the students reflecting on the program. There were self-reflection key definitions. The programming behaviors was broken down to the interpret prompt, search for analogous problems, adopt a solution, and evaluate. And the self-regulation, along with the definitions, were planning, process monitoring, comprehension monitoring, self-explanation, reflection, and rationale. The results. What degree of in situ regulation do learners engage in? And in order to answer this particular question, they had to perform 3 analyses. The first analysis was to code and compute the frequency of the behaviors in Table 1. The second analysis was to investigate whether there were distinct patterns of student behavior through clustering. And the final analysis was to see if student survey responses about their journaling process for the maturity or reflection. Now, the frequency of behaviors was explained to see if the frequency of self-reflective behaviors, which were developed with the coding scheme based on the framework from prior work on programming and self-regulation. They had to code each statement for each journal entry to identify if it demonstrated more than one of these behaviors. And the codes were randomly selected from journals that was adjacent from context if necessary. The cluster of behaviors was broken down into prior work that was suggested to be a large variation of self-regulation behaviors. To better understand this variation, they had to attempt to cluster students based on which behaviors they did or did not exhibit in their journals. They had to begin a binary variable for each student and each behavior in Table 1 that was true if at least one journal exhibited that behavior and the false was otherwise. The maturity of reflection. Now, the first 2 analyses was considered the frequency of the reflection and the patterns and reflection activity, where the third analysis was considered the maturity of the reflection. Now, they define the word maturity as the degree to which self-regulation was integrated part of student programming processes. Now, in order to analyze the maturity, they had to quantitatively code the responses that the student gave to the 2 journaling survey questions analyzing the students and how they write about their journaling process. Now, the question 2, what did the student report was challenging about reflect? And in order to answer that particular question, the students had to have a survey response, and it was broken down to 3 ways. How did the student reflect on programming processes? How did the student encounter their difficulties with their mental work? And how they can self-reflect. This particular slide shows at the Table 2, and it's the second half of one student's journal for for the first homework, showing the codes applied from Table 1. And this particular student was in high coverage cluster. In Table 3 is the range of student entries exhibiting each self-regulation or programming behaviors by assignment, showing higher frequencies of evaluation, planning process, monitoring, and self-explanation than other behaviors, and interpret only occurring once per assignment. Whereas the Table 4, which was the 3 clusters of behavior and the size of cluster, each percentage indicates the proportion of students in the cluster who exhibited the behavior at least once in the journal. Discussion. All participants had to monitor their process and evaluate their solutions. 1/3 of students engaged and 1/3 of students engaged in self-regulation behavior. Some of the students never engaged in interpreting the prompt and adapting previous solutions, and when they did, they typically engaged in self-regulation behaviors. And it was also found that students were either process unaware, were struggling with integrating reflection into the process, or had a mature programming process that conflicted with the reflection. The interpretation of the results. One of the challenges that the participants reported when reflecting in the journals that the concept of programming was too abstract for some of the participants. And this all because that the training that was provided to them was filled with the definitions and the examples for all the behaviors that was to comply in their practice. And it was simply adequate for some of the students. Another interpretation is that the participants were very simple but not very aware of the process and had problems identifying and understanding the mental behaviors that they were engaging in. And because of the metacognitive awareness is something that must be developed over time. And the combination of these two interpretations was very recalled of a challenge, and in detailing the mental work was also due to a lack of experience thinking about their own thinking. And the implications in the future work. Now the result was very important implication for future self-regulation in the intervention research. The results suggested that educators seeking to scaffold the development of self-regulation skills should consider that the students' current self-regulation skills. The challenges reported by our participants demonstrating that the interventions intended to help build self-regulation skills may act to needlessly slow down and hinder some of the students' abilities to produce. Now the students will fall into the high coverage or moderate coverage clusters may disregard the intervention in the favor of their current workflows, which result in wasted efforts with no benefits. Here's my reference page. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the evening, and thank you for listening to my presentation. Take care.